Shalom, everybody. It's Gav. I'm going to give a little bit of a talk today. We see in the news all the time about Hamas, the terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip. It's really just the Palestinian version of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. I am not going to say that Hamas is not a threat. Very clearly, they are. I think they reached the apex of being a threat in the 90s when they introduced suicide bombing into the conflict. We've kind of learned how to deal with that and get around that threat. So they resort now to, they have complete control of the Gaza Strip since 2006, 2007. And, obviously they fire rockets periodically, launch mortars. They'll do cross-border attacks through their tunnels. But ultimately, Hamas is not a long-term strategic threat. They don't have a particularly impressive pool of candidates to recruit from. They are a mostly, except for like the top leadership, they're a mostly all volunteer force. They don't get paid or anything. They're ragtag. They're a militia at best. And of course, I'm not downplaying their status as a terrorist group. It's very clear that they are a terrorist group. Much of the world recognizes them as such. They are not, however, as big a threat as the terror group on our northern border, which is Hezbollah. There are a number of different reasons for this. Hamas and Hezbollah, although they cooperate, are not in any way on an equal level. Hezbollah actually has kind of like this very subtle, not public contempt for Hamas because they see them as, how do I put this? If you were to put Hamas and Hezbollah together in a room, and you try to compare them in some way, it's like trying to compare. I'm not. Look, don't mistake what I'm about to say for a term of endearment. I'm not. Hezbollah is steak to Hamas being a hot dog. They're the leftover retreads of terrorism. Let's put it that way. Hezbollah is a much bigger long-term threat. And here's why. We've been making a mistake in how we classify them. Yes, Hezbollah is a terror group. No doubt about it. They're also a political party. No doubt about it. And by the way, so is Hamas. Here's the thing. We've been making a mistake in classifying them as paramilitary or as a militia. The correct way, in my view, to define Hezbollah would be as a part of the Iranian military. Let's be very clear about something. Hezbollah wears uniforms. They have rank insignias. They get paid. They get their paychecks from Iran, from the IRGC. They're armed by Iran. The uniforms they wear are Iranian military uniforms. They're all trained in Iran. It's harder to get them trained now. A lot of times they do it locally. They'll bring an instructor from Iran to train them in Lebanon or Syria. But what used to be the case before the Syrian civil war made this more difficult is they would fly all of their recruits to Iran to be trained in Iran and then back to Lebanon. And all of these recruits are Shia Muslim Arabs, just like Iran is a Muslim state, a Shia state. And they believe in the same specific type of Shia Islam that the Iranian state does. In short, Hezbollah is basically a foreign legion of the Iranian army that operates in Syria and Lebanon. That's how we should be seeing them. And I'm not trying to scare people, but guess what? They have a higher budget than the IDF does. Hezbollah has the latest equipment, and they have the wherewithal and the knowledge and the training to use it, and to use it effectively. In 2006, in July, so the Israeli Navy was patrolling off the coast of Lebanon and was enforcing a naval blockade on the south of Lebanon to try and keep Hezbollah from rearming. The INS Hanit, which is a missile class, a missile ship in the Israeli Navy, was struck by a Chinese-made anti-surface ship missile. 4 sailors were killed. This ship itself is an amazing technological marvel. It has countermeasures that were supposed to, shoot down incoming surface-to-ship missiles, but those were disabled. They were intentionally disabled because it was not believed that Hezbollah had the capability. First of all, it was not known that Hezbollah had these weapons. It's assumed that it was probably manufactured in China and then exported to Iran, which then, of course, re-gifted it to Hezbollah. It was not believed that, one, Hezbollah had these missiles, and even if they did have them, it was not believed that they knew how to use them adequately. Both assumptions were wrong. They did have these missiles, and they did have crews who knew how to use them. 4 Israeli sailors were killed. The Hanit had to return to its port, I believe, in Ashdod for repairs. It didn't sink it, thank God. The very first day of the war in 2006, Hezbollah executed, and again, I hate to give them credit for anything, an excellent special operations style cross-border raid on an IDF patrol, and they took 2. It's assumed they weren't alive at the time. They took 2 bodies back to Lebanon that they could use as negotiating chips. And the force that pursued them across the border into South Lebanon, they set up an ambush for along the main highway. Again, not knowing they had this technology. Again, even if they did have it, not knowing that they knew how to actually use it. They used very sophisticated and modern anti-tank weapons, and they blew up an entire IDF armored column, and they caused it to slow down operations for the first part of the day there. They were not able to pursue immediately. And that took the IDF leadership by surprise. We didn't think that they had these capabilities, and we didn't understand necessarily how they were able to pinpoint where to ambush us going into South Lebanon. I say us, I mean Israel, the IDF. I was not in the IDF at that time, but I've studied quite a bit about that conflict. And what a lot of people didn't know at the time, again, another faulty assumption, is that Hezbollah was not particularly sophisticated. The reality is that they had top-of-the-line, Russian-made listening equipment. They had systems where they could listen in on reserve commanders on their cell phones. I mean, do you hear what I'm saying? They could listen in to our guys talking back and forth to each other on their personal cell phones. In Hebrew, Hezbollah actually sends people abroad, mostly to the UK, to study Hebrew, and then they bring them back to Lebanon to use as linguists. Hezbollah is an army. It's not a ragtag militia. The Geneva Convention, since the 1960s, has stated that paramilitary groups are protected by the Geneva Convention provided they meet 3 criteria. 1, they carry arms openly. 2, they don't violate the rules of war. And 3, that they wear some type of military fatigue or some type of something that identifies them as combatants. Hezbollah, for the most part, always wears uniforms. Occasionally they don't, but for the most part, and I've seen a lot of the helmet cam footage from places like in Marun al-Ras and Bint Jebel, the fighting, they all wore Iranian fatigues, Iranian helmets, carried Iranian-supplied AKs. They carried arms openly, except for a few times where they disguised missile launching pads. The only thing that's disqualifying them under the Geneva Convention right now from being a legitimate fighting force is their adherence to the rules of war, which they don't. They were able to shell Israeli cities in the north. They killed 44 Israeli civilians, I think half a dozen other foreign tourists. And they gave us quite a bit of a fight in South Lebanon. The war lasted 34 days. They claim that only 250 of them were killed, which we know is a lie. I mean, even the Lebanese government cites that number as more than doubled. I think there's more than 500 of them that were killed. But the reality is they were able to give us quite a sock on the nose, and we weren't expecting it. We were not expecting that they would or that they could. And I hate to say it, much of their senior leadership and some of their best fighters have been killed in the conflict in Syria, but they are much better armed than they were in 2006. They have massive rocket stockpiles throughout South Lebanon. And the thing is, if we ever have to go to war again in South Lebanon, it would be much messier this time. And what I mean by that is the international reaction, which was far from stellar back then. People were it's very clear they thought we had no business being there, even though we were attacked. And we are occupying nothing that belongs to Lebanon and certainly nothing that belongs to Iran. Again, we're not occupying anything that belongs to Hamas or the Palestinians either, but that's a separate discussion unto its own. So if we have to go to war in South Lebanon again, South Lebanon is like Swiss cheese. It's all carved out underground. There are miles of tunnels that they've dug, bunkers that we can't see, underground compounds and bases that we can't see with the naked eye. We can see them in infrared, and we know from electronic signatures basically where they all are. But here's the problem. They deliberately put them under villages, next to schools, that type of thing. So they know that in order to hit them, we have to retaliate in such a way that there's no way we can come close to guaranteeing we're not going to hurt innocent people. So they can basically hit us as hard as they want, and they can pack a much worse wallop now than they did in 2006. Anytime they wanted to, they could. Why the restraint has lasted this long, I'm not sure. I think part of it has to do with what's the ongoing in Syria. It's not quite as easy for them to rearm as it was 10 years ago. And it's part of the reason why they haven't started anything. Other than that, it's pretty much anyone's guess. But they're a much bigger long-term threat. And if Iran, let's just assume that anything Iran has, Hezbollah can also get pretty much overnight. If Iran develops a nuclear weapon, Hezbollah, not Hamas, is going to get it first. They could turn South Lebanon into a launching pad very easily. It basically already is one by de facto. And, behind Iran, the Chinese and the Russians give Iran the most sophisticated Eastern Bloc weaponry and equipment that you can possibly buy. And of course, a lot of that goes straight to Hezbollah. So it's not an insurmountable threat. We can definitely deal with them, but it's going to be ugly. It's going to be a lot uglier than the conflicts, when we fought with them in 2006, and a lot uglier than the conflicts we fought in Gaza in the last decade or so. A lot uglier. And we'll pay a lot more for it. I mean, there are cities on the northern border that, if we were to go to war with Hezbollah, would probably be destroyed. We would suffer pretty massive civilian casualties, and the IDF would suffer pretty large casualties too before gaining the upper hand. But keep the eye on the prize. Hamas, sure, they're deadly. Yes, they can kill innocent people. Yes, they can draw us into a conflict. Look at the tactics they're resorting to now. They're sending teenagers, old ladies, and women to go attack the border fence and be shot for cameras. That's the tactics they're using now. It's not particularly sophisticated, but they know it works. Hezbollah is not going to do that because they actually have a core group of very well-trained, highly motivated religious fanatics that are willing to go and fight and die while armed and attacking troops. And that's what comes some of the key differences, and that's why it's important to keep the eye on the prize, keep an eye on what's going on in the north. People are asking me all the time, why does Prime Minister Netanyahu always talk about not letting Hezbollah gain a foothold in the Golan Heights? Because, being surrounded on two fronts, both in South Lebanon and on our border with Syria by Hezbollah, is not good. It's really not good. Hamas is an easier threat to contain, Hezbollah not so much. And we're committed right now, our defense doctrine is to take any action necessary to prevent them from gaining any further footholds, because they're the real threat. they're they have the potential to, they're not right now, but they have the potential to become an existential threat. And so just kind of keep your eye on the prize. And anytime you hear about Gaza or Hamas in the news, just keep in mind that while horrible, they can't destroy us. Right now, Hezbollah can't either, but they could, in a few very short steps, they could get to that point. So just kind of keep that in mind.